Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast, such as myself, and good morning on the West Coast. I'm not sure. I did see some international folks coming in as well, so not sure where you're at, but welcome. Needless to say, we are going to be having a great talk for about an hour today. I always laugh. That they ask me to speak about things like this very complicated talk for only an hour, so I'm going to do my best to cut it down and make sure that I can get as much in as possible as I can in an hour. But I like to be pretty informal. I am a school psychologist by training, and I know that a lot of psychologists are in the room with me today, so welcome. I do have a chat box over there on the left-hand side of the screen. You can put some questions in. Because we have a very large group joining us, I may or may not see it. So if I can see something, if I see it come through, I'll let you know. But let's get started. I like to think of these webinars in a way that kind of connects me with you as a group and as an audience. And I always picture myself sort of standing in front of a large group of folks with very complicated hypotheses and equations behind me, and everybody diligently writing down notes and so forth. So that's the way that I like to think about things happening. But to be honest, what I'd rather us all consider ourselves here, right? This will be our lecture hall where we're sitting all on beach chairs and just enjoying the waves hitting the shore behind us. We have the hats of our favorite baseball teams on and so forth. You can see there I have my Pirates hat on, and I'm just enjoying the sun. So hopefully we can all kind of come together to enjoy this together today. So, I do listen to a lot of TED Talks, and, it's not going to be 20 minutes, but we'll try our best to get that interaction going. With regard to our content today, this is a really interesting topic I was asked to talk about for this webinar series. And, I had a couple questions. I hope you all read that, read the description of the webinar, because it's true that, when we think about PSW and we think about the ways for us to analyze and look at learning, we've been driven by, federal and state regulations that for a long time have been one-sided. And now that we have many options, this one option, the PSW model, has been sort of, I don't want to say forgotten, but it hasn't received as much fanfare as some of the others like RTI. So that was in my description, and hopefully that came through to you, and that's really what we're going to really work on today. So, we're going to process through this process by really looking at questions. And I know that this is otherwise known as an agenda, but I wanted to think about it this way. I thought it would be a better way for us to focus and guide our process today, which is we're going to start with what learning is, and we're going to talk about what is learning or the dysfunction of learning. We're going to first briefly go over the law so that we're all on the same page. How complicated can learning be? It can be fairly complicated. Is it just a one-to-one correspondence as we have, as people tend to think it is? Or is it more complex? And I will give some examples of how complex it can get. I'm going to talk about an example of PSW. I'm going to talk about an example of how we actually complete it with the WISC-V and the WIAT and KTEA-3. So just so that you all know, I am an employee of Pearson. So Pearson does publish WISC-V and KT and WIAT-III. So just so you all know that before we go on, I just wanted to disclose that to everybody, make sure we're all on the same page. I did get a couple, just for some housekeeping stuff, people coming through that are saying my voice isn't very clear, there's an echo. There should be something on the top left where you can pause audio and then restart it. That may help. That's sometimes dependent on your bandwidth. My internet connection and bandwidth is very fast, so what's coming through from me is then having to be spread out to a very large number of people. So if that becomes an issue, I apologize. You can also dial in on the phone. I think Sherry just put the number in there on the left. You can do that as well if your audio is really driving you nuts. First things first, let's oh wow, this came through very strange. Hopefully the spacing issues don't show up. I apologize, this looks very strange to me. We're going to first talk about eligibility and need for directed specialized instruction. So we're going to think about how we determine a specific learning disability based on the law. And I know this is going to be a review for most of you, but let's make sure we're on the same page when we look at IDEA of 2004, IDEA of 2004. And I think the most important things that we really want to make sure we're understanding here is that at that point, the federal law basically said that we don't have to require severe discrepancy between ability and achievement, and that was a big turning point in our profession and in education. And then it did say that we have to at least allow states or allow local education associations or agencies to permit an RTI, research-based intervention system, but also they allowed us to permit some other stuff too, and the other stuff was research-based procedures. And I think that's where we really kind of opened ourselves up a little bit to saying, hey, there's more out there that we can really focus on. Discrepancy, while if used correctly, does have some benefits, really had some weaknesses as well. And we found that over time. I got into the profession in the early 2000s, so I've been for a little bit over a decade, and that's when we were really kind of just starting to move outside of the severe discrepancy model. But in talking to some colleagues who had been in the profession longer and have been using discrepancy for quite some time, it really caused a lot of issues that we had to account for, to change, to really move forward in education. The important thing to think about here is that when we're looking at part of the law, part of the law does allow us to think about children who are not achieving adequately, and this really is the reflection of what would be considered an ability achievement discrepancy model. So we really think about ability being high and achievement being low, and that's a way that we can conceptualize or can diagnose or classify a learning disorder, but also really moving into the idea about response to intervention and whether or not a child is responding appropriately to evidence-based intervention lets us know whether or not that child has a learning disability or not. So, everyone gets some level of intervention. Some people get a larger amount of intervention, and then very few require an even larger yet amount of intervention. So basically what we're saying is that, hey, look, if we have a few people who are not responding to basic levels of intervention or effective instruction, then we can consider those folks to be learning disabled or have a specific learning disability. And then when we move into how the law really did say a pattern of strengths and weaknesses in performance, achievement, or in both relative to their age, it really opened up a can of worms. Not necessarily a can of worms, but it opened up a lot of leeway for us to say, hey, let's start to think about those research-based ideas that we've been thinking about in academia for quite some time. And I think that was a great thing. I know that was a great thing for our profession, because it really started to say, let's pull out the research that we've been seeing time and time again and try to apply that to school classification systems, a la neuropsychology practice for decades, and how that's been happening. But really, it left us with a lot of questions, didn't it? It left us with questions about what exactly that should be. How do we apply it? What exactly would be a processing strength and weakness? So it gave us some opportunity, but at the same time, I really feel like, wow, it might have given us some questions that came up to really think about what we should do effectively. For a long time, we have to be able to break down, if we're thinking about processes, right, we have to be able to break down what processes are involved in all of that. What components or what skills are involved in the processes that are so important. So I like to think about breaking it down first, and that's going to be the next part of our talk which is really breaking down what learning is potentially. What are we looking for? How do we say that a child's process is dysfunctional or is not effective to manage learning? The first thing I start with is CHC. I like to break it down into various skills and think about all of the components to those various skills. And really in that vein, we can start to think about learning as being a big pizza. Yes, I'm a big fan of pizza. Who isn't, right? I love pizza and had a great one the other day in the airport in Detroit. But I like to think about it as pizza and what components of that pizza are necessary for a specific task. Now, this is just a general learning slide, right? So if I'm thinking about learning in general, it can be made up of crystallized skills. It can be made up of a very fluid reasoning type of a skill. It can be made up of Visual-Spatial or memory, speeded processing. It can have all of those components. And of course, this pizza pie would look very different if I was talking about reading versus math versus writing. So we're going to have very different looking pies, right? We have all of these different skills that contribute to what learning is. We can also think about it as basic skills that lead to one thing, right? Phonological processing, vocabulary, orthographic processing, that is what makes up, or that's what we're considering in this slide here, to make up reading, our ability to read. But is that really true? Are we able to separate out each of the skills and say, hey, this is what is necessary to read? I think that becomes very, very complex, and from an assessment standpoint, that becomes very complex. We have to pull out multiple tests, multiple skill level assessments, and think about how they work together, right? The only way that we know whether or not a child can read or not is actually what their output is. What can they do? We have to see, they have to give it to us. They have to be able to produce it for us. And then we essentially are breaking down that process piece. We're breaking down where are those weaknesses occurring and how do those weaknesses occur in light of whatever those relative strengths are. So let's just think about the process of learning and think about how that potentially works, right? So if we think about learning as a process of acquiring information, we have to also then think about what cognitive factors are necessary for the child to not only learn, but also to show what they can do. How do they know what to do, and how can they show what to do? And I always like to think about not only the factors involved there, but what other factors can be necessary, such as how do they take in information? Where are they processing that information, or how are they bringing it into themselves, and then how do they put it out? Where's that going? And the best way to think about that is through an input, process, output paradigm, right? So how is that information, or what is necessary for information to get into somebody's brain? The process part of it is, of course, much more complex in thinking what processes are involved and how do they interact with each other. It's much less about the specific skills than it is about how they work together. And then how does a child tell us what they know? What is their output? I think that the way of thinking about it like this becomes much more clear to me what we're looking at for specifically for learning disability, because it's not about input or output. That's the hard part. Figuring out what levels of that input or what levels of output affect a child is a rule out, right? So we have to be able to think about what is in the middle there. So we necessarily, in this situation, rule out the input and output phase because that's not what constitutes a specific learning disability. That may constitute something very different, and I like to think about it as maybe some sensory motor functions in learning in this regard. Visually, auditorily, are they seeing the information? Are they hearing the information? Are we having any limits there? Are they able to respond? Writing, oral responses. I mean, you could probably come up with 10 more. What other areas are affecting the input and output phase? That's not what we're looking at for learning disability, except to rule it out, right? So that's the area that we need to focus on first to say, hey, those things are not a problem. And this is a slide that I did get from, it's a KT3, the Kaufman Test of Educational Achievement 3 slide, and it comes from the new revision. And the great thing about this in the manual is that it really shows each of the subtests and how they and how to process them based on this input, process, output paradigm or idea, right? So for something like written expression, if we think about how is that information, what's necessary there for input, the directions are spoken, there are pictures there are words and sentences on a page, spoken stimuli, time limit for essay, right? The output is going to be written. There are some open-ended questions. There's constrained. And what are the processes required? So acquired knowledge and achievement, writing ability, English usage with grammar and syntax. We have verbal working memory, executive functions, planning, strategy use, etc. And that's the area, that center. Let me bring out my little handy-dandy little highlighter. That's the center area that we have to think about the most, right? So is a learning disability any of these areas? No, it's not. So if you have a student who is, let's say, blind and they have difficult time writing, is it that they have a learning disability in writing? They can possibly, right? But most of the time we have to think about what is the process in the middle that is affecting their ability to write, if we can rule out the input and output phases. So these next couple of slides, what I have here are how all of these things interact with or affect learning. So attention. Now this is a tough one. The way that I process attention is that it is possible that attention is affecting the input phase, right? So I don't want you to just rule this out as being something just affecting input of information, because it can also attention can also affect the processing of information cognitively. So if I am not paying attention to components of a task, for example, then that can affect working memory. Let's say I'm only processing 2 components of a 3-part task. Am I missing details, etc. So there are parts of attention that also do affect the learning process. The same is true for visual-spatial processing. What parts of those skills are necessary? We know that it plays a major role in the development of handwriting skills and fluency in math and reading. We know that much of what's in school is going to be either visual-spatial or language. So visual-spatial processes are, of course, going to be one of the areas that we have to think about when we're looking at a PSW model. The example here I have is a student may be able to name individual letters in a word. She may be unable to integrate the letters to say the word. So in that situation, if a child is, if she can name individual words, right? So that's a visual process, right? We have to be able to look at the letters and see them accurately and the visual analysis of it. But then to synthesize them together and understand the whole is breaking down. So that could be an area where it's affecting a child's learning. The same is true for language and learning, right? So if a child is not developing language appropriately or doesn't have an effective vocabulary, then that's going to affect their acquisition of literacy, right? So we know that language, we know that visual-spatial processing, attention, they're all going to be areas we need to consider. Speeded processing as well. We know that speed, the ability for somebody to be flexible and be fluid, can affect things like fluency, right? So how fluent is somebody with a specific educational or academic task? Let's see here. Where's next? Okay. And then another one that's pretty important to think about is, of course, working memory. Now, I really appreciate the fact that this slide is a little bit big and there are parts covered over on it. Unfortunately, our presentation platform here doesn't allow me to do animations, but this is supposed to be an animated slide where you can see it a little bit differently. But I have it separated out, based on some of Badley and Hitch's ongoing research studies, and this one was an integrated model from 2003. basically thinking about how complex working memory can be. But if we look at working memory in this regard, we can see that the visual side, visual cache and interscribe, can be responsible for a lot of the visual motor and reading and so forth, and language based on the phonological and articulatory loop side. We have the interaction of executive functioning and memory, as well as that visual and language system that I talked about on the earlier slides. So if we think about learning as being complex, and we know that working memory is necessary for learning, we can start to think about how we need to break down these processes. So it's not just about where a child is having difficulty, it's about what type of process they're having difficulty with. So if I think about all of that and move a little bit forward with regard to current assessment practices or processes, and we want to think about all of the areas of CHC or what have you to really break down this PSW idea, we need to think about major assessments and how that fits, right? So going back to the WISC-IV in 2003, the Cattell-Horn-Carroll and how it was analyzed, the 4 factors were analyzed in 2003. They found that with the WISC-IV, we were able to match up several domains. I have 6 domains there measured in WISC-IV, right? So we have GF, we have GC, GS, processing speed, visual-spatial abilities, GV, short-term memory, more of a conscious awareness measure for GSM, and quantitative knowledge with GQ. When we think about how that was developed over time, we saw a few studies come out in 2005 and then again in 2008, really looking at that confirmatory or cross-battery analysis compared to the WJ3 and the WISCs. I'm trying to figure out whether or not the WISCs were actually measuring some of these GFGC components. And again, Phelps and colleagues in 2005 found that was actually true. So the WISC-IV added in fluid reasoning, auditory processing, and long-term retrieval. And then again, Keith in 2006 really did extend that WISC 2004 studies and found those following factors as being measured by the WISC-IV. So I like to think about that if we can, this is the WISC-V, these are the WISC-V factors. But I like to think about if we can really break apart the WISC-V factors in relationship or with respect to fluid reasoning, visual-spatial processing, crystallized knowledge. If we can break it apart based on some of the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theories, we can really start to think about it with respect to, hold on, my slide did not move. I apologize. Let me get rid of this. Whoa, sorry about that. My slides are jumping all over the place, so hopefully I'm in the right spot. Okay. If I'm in the right spot, you all should be seeing a very complex Dean-Woodcock model. But if you start to break apart ability tests like the WISC and think about it in terms of GFGC components, you can really start to analyze cognition like this with regard to input, process, and output. Now, this is the Dean-Woodcock neuropsych model, and I love this model. It's a little complex with thinking about where all of them fit, and I think there's some limitations here with regard to attention and executive functions. But what we see here very clearly is that Dean Woodcock and Schrank, also Dr. Decker, completed this model with regard to input, right? So we have the input of physical stimuli into conscious awareness in the sensory register, then moving into the processes involved, which is the process of all of those skills together with acquired knowledge that we already have, and the filter, which is really our conscious way, our executive functioning way of managing all those, and then the output, which is cognitive performance, a motor performance, action, right, reflexive action. Are we writing? Are we saying? That's the output phase of that. So I think if we keep going back to the idea of input, process, output, we could make it as complex or as simple as possible, depending on what information we have. All right, now my slide's not going forward again. All right, okay, good. Here it is. I apologize for any of the lag, folks, but again, we have a very large group here, and that's possibly what's going on, but maybe not. Maybe it's just me. I have these next two slides really to think about KT3 and CHC. So, you know, the first couple of slides that I just showed you there were about breaking down ability tests based on CHC theory or GFGC, but we could do the same with academic achievement tests. Now, I can tell you that I travel the country and talk to a lot of our colleagues across the country a lot, and a question that I get, not a lot, but once in a while is, you know, why are you using academic achievement tests to measure GFGC or to validate some of those cognitive components? And my response is that just because it's an academic achievement test does not mean that you are not required to use or that it does not tap cognitive or learning components, right? So it's absolutely true that when I'm looking at something like reading vocabulary, for example, you can see that up here on the screen, that it's going to require crystallized knowledge. It is a crystallized task. We're looking at specific reading vocabulary knowledge, right? So we know that we can actually pull some of these components out of an academic achievement test, such as the KT3. Again, we can go down and look at letter naming facility. We have speed processing, long-term retrieval. Phonological processing is right there. It's a direct one-to-one for GA. So you can see how that fits here, right? That we are not only breaking down this based on academic function, but also based on cognitive skill or cognitive components as well. All right. Let's think about how we find consistency between cognitive and academic tasks. So the first part of our talk was really about learning, what is learning, what causes learning, what can learning potentially be. And I think that right now, what we're at this point of our talk, it's pretty clear that learning is a process, and that learning as input, process, and output is probably the most efficient way or the most accurate way for us to, effective way for us to really consider dysfunction. So where is that dysfunction occurring? And I think as school psychologists or psychologists in practice, one of the hard things for us to do is to find consistency and inconsistency. So looking at the difference between cognitive and academic tasks can be helpful to drive our thinking there. I like this as well. This is from the KT3. KT3 allows us to use qualitative observations in order to verify or validate some observations of behavior, basically, during an assessment, right? So I just brought this up. This is just an example I threw together. But if we're thinking about language or achievement areas, let's say that a child is taking a reading comprehension task, and they have difficulty with that reading comprehension task, and they exhibit a behavior that is similar to or reflects working memory deficit, then I can start to see where certain cognitive components or certain cognitive skills can potentially be impacting the learning on that task, right? And this is exactly what we're trying to do with PSW, aren't we? We're trying to figure out what weaknesses, what cognitive weaknesses could be potentially affecting learning or potentially affecting performance on academic achievement tasks. So if we think about it this way, if we think about breaking it down this way, we can start to see consistencies across subtests. So just this example I have up here, this potential student had language processing weaknesses on one test, had automaticity difficulties on basic reading, had working memory difficulties on listening comprehension, reading comprehension, and spelling, and math calculation, they had automaticity difficulties. So really, the great thing here is we can start to see consistencies of behavior, not only in performance on tasks, but also consistency in behavior across multiple tasks, right? So that's really essentially what we're going to be doing. All right, so I really like these next couple of slides. Hopefully they're not too busy for all of you. I try to make things not too busy, but I know it occurs. These are going to be more for reference, so hopefully you all use them as reference when you want to engage in a PSW analysis. But what I did here was I pulled apart specific or types of academic achievement tasks and how you can compare those, or what specific indexes or subtests you can compare those to get some consistency, to understand how they relate cognitively and academically, right? So if I look at a test like word reading, we know that if I'm looking at the WISC-V, for example, the VCI and the auditory working memory index, the AWMI, are indexes that would be related. So they would be very similar functions. Subtests like digit span, vocabulary, complementary measures like the delayed symbol translation, naming speed, literacy, those are all related to word reading. So if I'm looking for consistency of deficit, if I have a child who's taking the word reading test and they have also difficulty with digit span, vocabulary, naming speed, literacy, their VCI is low, then I could start to think about how that relates. Same is true for pseudo-word decoding. Those are also related to the same measures. Now, if I look at the next slide here, reading comprehension, we add their fluid reasoning index. We add in similarities, matrix reasoning, okay, so arithmetic. So we know that if we think about deficits in reading comprehension, we also then want to look at consistency of deficits for other cognitive measures. Oral reading fluency there. We see VCI, NSI, AWMI. So again, these are going to be for your reference because we only have an hour today, and I'm going to try my best to get through everything. But I just wanted to make sure that you feel comfortable with where to find some of that information. And even though this is really limited to more KT, WIAT-III, and WISC-V and processing with that, you can do a really effective job if you can make this link. So here we go on this link here. We can see basic reading, total reading weaknesses, how those are related to certain WISC-V components, math calculation and problem solving. We see it adds in QRI, the VSI is added in there, digit span, figure weights, and it makes a lot of sense. But I think that when we're needing this link, looking at these couple of slides will help you do that. Math fluency, total math, essay composition and spelling, and then finally total writing. I do see a lot of folks coming through with questions about the handouts. I'm glad that you're interested in the handouts because I do have a lot of information in them. So if you did not get them, if you can't find that email that I sent out this morning, then let us know. But we'll try to get them to you as quickly as possible. Okay, let's think about PSW analysis. Let's think about what exactly it is. So with all of that in mind, do we have a blood test for SLD? Do we have something that we say, okay, I'm going to look at this little piece, this little droplet of blood and say yes or no, this child has SLD? And of course we don't, right? Of course we don't have it. We don't have something that's just one-to-one will tell us yes or tell us no. That's why I think when we're looking at, or when we used to look at discrepancy, only discrepancy, that's where we fell short. It's not to say that ability achievement discrepancy doesn't have its place and that it's not effective. It's just that when we were only using that and we were mandated to only use that, we had some limitations, right? So if we have to think about input, process, output, using the PSW approach will be that sort of blood test, I guess, if you want to call it that. I think it'll improve our accuracy when we're actually making these comparisons. So I switched it to this slide because I think when we hear PSW or we hear pattern of strengths and weaknesses, we have to figure out what models there are out there and what we should actually be using. Now, there are three main ones. They are the most prominent research-based methods, and I have them listed up here. Concordance, discordance, discrepancy, consistency, and the cross-battery assessment approach. And I am not here to verify or push one or the other. Really, what I'd like to do is I like to say go and read up on them all, because I find that each one of them has a strength for different purposes, but they do have some consistencies across them all that make them very, very effective methods. So their commonalities basically across all three of them are that they all basically rule out those exclusionary factors as part of a definition of learning disability. So those exclusionary factors being what affects the input and the output that I talked about earlier. They all do identify a cognitive processing weakness that would be then related to an achievement weakness, and they all identify one or more areas of strength that are unrelated to the achievement weakness. They do differ, slightly differ based on what tests they require or what tests they ask you to use, but and that really does speak to the criteria for defining their strengths and weaknesses. So that's really where some of the differences occur across all three of those models. If we think about what is PSW, I think this is really the crux of our talk today. What is it? And I think it makes sense what I said earlier. I think what I said earlier is probably kind of ringing true with all of you that, yeah, okay, Adam, I get it. Learning is complex. It's just not a one-to-one correspondence. There are factors we have to consider and how they relate to one another. But with regard to PSW, what exactly is it? It does require us to identify a processing weakness. And what I mean by processing weakness is one of those areas of, let's say, the WISC or the WJ or the DOS, that we have to pull out to say that this child is exhibiting some level of cognitive or processing weakness, right? It does allow us to differentiate between SLD and underachievement for other reasons. So if we're looking at the processing weakness, then we can really differentiate what a true SLD would be versus just regular typical underachievement. What's that underachievement occurring because of? If a child has a weakness in processing and a weakness in academic functioning, then we can say that is an SLD, right? We know that SLD does require individualized instruction responsive to processing strengths and weaknesses. We know that underachievement for other reasons does not. It might benefit from that, but it might benefit from other less intense interventions as well. And I think it's very important to consider PSW because of our current thinking that using RTI is not sufficient for diagnosing SLD. Using RTI is sufficient for determining or separating out who needs more intensive levels of intervention, but it's not sufficient in itself for the diagnosis of SLD. And I want to make it very clear that that's our business, right? Our business is to diagnose SLD. I think our business in schools, our business in a clinical realm is to say this is what's going on. And the idea of identification of interventions is part of that, but determining where that weakness is occurring is really what our bag is. It's like it's our bag, right? It's what we do. It's the psychological part of being a school psychologist. So think about what the methods and statistical requirements are for PSW. I'll go over this very quickly because I want to make sure that everybody feels pretty confident with what we have to look for here. But when we're making score comparisons, we have to compare scores and make sure that they are significantly different. So we do have to have that discrepancy there. We have to make sure there's a statistical difference there between processing strengths and achievement weaknesses and between processing strengths and processing weaknesses. So we have to make sure that there is a significant or discrepant difference between those. We also have to think about if there is a consistency between the achievement weakness and the processing weakness. Now, while that's not necessarily a statistical component of PSW, it does provide us with a rationale for learning disability, right? If we can say that the achievement weakness we're witnessing is because of also an observed processing weakness, then we can absolutely say that's the rationale for learning disability. I just saw a quick question come through asking me how I define significant. Well, significant would be based on the clinically significant difference model. So whenever we're making subtest comparisons, pairwise comparisons, we can look at software or some of the tables in the manuals for any assessment we use and determine whether or not that difference is beyond statistical capability and whether or not it's rare. So if it meets statistical significance and clinical significance, that's really what I'm talking about. So in PSW, we do talk about that score comparisons are evaluated using the simple difference method rather than a regression method. And the reason for that is it does not imply a causal relationship. So we're not saying that there's a one-to-one causal relationship with the weakness that we're finding in cognition and the weakness that we're finding in achievement. That's what AAD is. That's what the achievement ability discrepancy model is, right? So it's more or less more effective for us to look at a simple difference method rather than regression. Also, thinking about the PSW model, if comparisons are not statistically significant, then that child does not demonstrate a pattern that's consistent with SLD, right? So essentially, if we do not find that consistency or that concordance and discordance, then we're not able to then say that it is an SLD issue. But it's always so important that you use clinical judgment in multiple data points, because we never use just one piece of data to drive our thinking, right? We should never, ever. We should have never used just discrepancy to drive our diagnosis of SLD in the past, which is sometimes what was required of us by states. So you always should use multiple data points to really drive that. Okay, let me think about the PSW and WISC-V real quick, because the WISC-V is fairly new, and I just want to make sure that you understand what PSW and WISC-V and how they sort of fit together. But with regard to PSW and WISC-V, it does most closely resemble the concordance and discordance model that Hale and Fiorello put out in their book. It is a very accepted and a clinically sound approach. So what I want you to know is that the PSW model for the WISC-V, it reflects parts of all of those three models that I showed you at the beginning, but it most closely resembles what we find in the concordance and discordance model. You're also able to use this with the WISC-V for research-supported cognitive and neuropsych approaches to assessment. So you can use it if you are using as a school the cognitive hypothesis testing model. You can use it if you have a cross-battery assessment approach, the CHC theory, Lurian approaches, pass theory, etc. You can use the PSW approach with the WISC-V for all of these different areas. With the WISC-V, the naming, speed, literacy, and symbol translation subtest gives standard scores. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, the WISC-V, naming, speed, literacy, and symbol translation subtests give standard scores versus scaled scores. And the reason for that is, hold on a second, I lost my screen. The reason for that is for making comparisons, really. They are now directly comparable to other frequently used scores in PSW. So the WISC-V index scores, the subtest and composite standard scores on achievement measures like that use the WISC-IV. So we're able to make those direct relationships, and that's why that was done. If we look at the WISC-V in general, there are basically 3 steps to conducting PSW. The first one is selecting a subtest or composite score that corresponds to a primary achievement weakness. Step 2 is selecting the WISC-V standard score that represents the processing weakness. And step 3 would be to select the WISC-V standard score that represents the processing strength. Let's break those steps down a little bit more in detail. So for step 1, we look at the achievement weakness, right? So it should be a subtest or a composite score that corresponds to a primary achievement weakness. And what you should do in that situation is consider below average. And we tend to look at 85 and below, right? Now, there are some situations, and I think the situation that I show you in a little bit, an example, does show it as an 86. But you can use higher than 85 to consider that an achievement weakness. But we tend to use that, and that tends to be an appropriate cutoff, for when we're thinking about that weakness to occur. Consider selecting a subtest or composite score that corresponds to one of the IDEA specified areas of achievement or for identifying SLD. So that's another area to consider as well, making sure that you can directly relate that to one of the areas in the law. The other part is make sure you examine subtest variability within the composite score before you select it as an achievement weakness. We want to make sure that there's some it's a unitary measure, and if not, consider using one of the subtests. So if you see one of the composite scores that has a lot of variability in the subtest, consider using one of the subtests that's most representative of their weakness. Step 2, so you should select the WISC-V standard score that represents the processing weakness. Again, we have to pick one that's generally associated with the achievement weakness. You should examine subtest variability within the WISC-V standard scores as well before selecting a processing weakness. That is preferable, but it's not always necessary to use a different standard score. If you find a lot of variability, that's, again, going to use your clinical judgment. But you're going to want to make sure that you link something that is going to be related to the achievement weaknesses you're finding, right? And that goes back to the slides that I showed you before, which were had that link or had that direct link that you can really make those comparisons. And then step 3, select the WISC-V standard score that represents the processing strength. So you have to make sure that the processing strength is not typically related to an achievement weakness. So, for example, this is a very basic, straightforward one, but let's say that you are picking visual-spatial processing and as a strength, and the weakness is oral expression, for example, or something like that. I'm just coming up with two that are pretty widely not related. But those are that's really what we're looking at there. We're looking at making sure that the processing strength does not tend to be related to whatever weakness it is that we're finding. You should, again, examine the subtest variability within the standard scores before selecting the processing strength, and also avoid using the ones that I have listed up here. They tend not to be very accepted for use as a processing strength. Think about them. Think about kind of leaving those out of the step 3. I'm trying to move through this pretty quickly so that I make sure I can get to it. Okay, I have that slide there. You guys can review that at your leisure, but I only have a couple more minutes, and I want to make sure I have time for looking at some of your questions before I end. Okay, so let's look at what pattern of strengths and weaknesses could look like potentially if you're using. I think the first one I have here is the PSW model with WISC-V and also the WISC-III, the WIAT-III. So in this slide, you see this would be something that you could pull up using your printout, your report printout. But we see that for this child, the relative strength was the VCI. So you see the VCI at 114. So the first row there shows the processing strength is 114. The achievement weakness, the relative weakness score is numerical operations. So that was a 79. Right, and we see that the difference there is 35. The critical value is 8.82. So we see that is a significant difference. So does that support the SLD hypothesis? Yes, it does. If we look at the processing strength and the processing weakness, again, VCI is 114. Working memory is the weakness. So at 80, right, and we know that working memory is absolutely related to numerical operations and how a child completes math and numerical operations. So we see that there is some consistency between what we're finding, some consistency between the processing weakness and the achievement weakness, which is what we're hoping to find. That 34-point difference with a critical value of 10.18, I'm sorry, is also statistically significant, and that also supports our hypothesis. Here's another way to look at it. Sometimes you'll see it look like this with concordance and discordance. But we put the processing strength up at the top. We say that VCI verbal comprehension is 114, WIAT-III numerical operations at 79, WISC-IV working memory at 80. We're looking at discrepancies between A and B, and we find discrepancies between both of those. And again, that third part, which is, again, not necessary but related, is there a link or some consistency between both weaknesses? And, of course, there is in this situation. Let's look at it again. Let's look at a different example here, which is WISC-V and WIAT-III. I'm sorry, the previous one I showed you was WISC-IV and WIAT-III. This one is WISC-V and WIAT-III. I just want to show you what it looks like with this one as well. So what we chose for the area of achievement weakness for this youngster, they had a low score on word reading, which is a 72. Their processing strength was on VSI, Visual-Spatial Index was a 105, and their area of processing weakness here was the VCI, Verbal Comprehension Index, of 86. So the same thing is true. This is just a printout, so this would be your report printout, that if we're looking at the processing strength of 105 with the achievement weakness of 72, we see that that is a 33-point difference. The critical value is 10, and that does support our hypothesis of reading disability. If we look at the processing strength 105 and the processing weakness, which is VCI, we can see that 19-point difference has a 12-point critical value. Of course, that also does support our diagnosis. So really what I wanted to show you is that when we break down each of these areas, PSW, if I want to review very quickly, PSW allows us to think about that internal process piece. Where are those processes breaking down? And we see that this child's VCI, verbal comprehension area, is absolutely supportive of weaknesses in word reading, and we can start to really hypothesize where that process breaks down. So when we're thinking about diagnosis or classification, this process, in my mind, and I know a lot of different areas across the country are also now starting to use PSW quite frequently or exclusively, it's much more accurate to think about what is a SLD versus what is just a poor response to intervention, or what is an other factor, an other affected factor. So, our suggestion, our suggestion, even using some of these tests like the WISC and the WIAT and KTEA-3, is to look at it in this detail. It gives you so much more information to drive your hypotheses about where this child's learning is breaking down. All right. So we had an hour, and I have about 5 more minutes left, and I have a ton of questions that came through. So, so what I'd like to do is, for the next 5 minutes, I'm going to try to go through and answer some of the ones that came through, and I will probably end in about 5 minutes, and if I can get to some of the questions in an email response, I will do that as well. But before I go through this, if people want to, log out, they can. But I want to thank everybody for coming. Hopefully you enjoyed my talk today, and hopefully it got you really thinking and thinking about how to use PSW, or if you should. And we'll see you on the next side. But let me get to some of the questions that are here. So let me go to the questions page. I did have a question. Is an IQ test or an ability test the best tool to use to determine the pattern of strengths and weaknesses? It's part of that. I think you can effectively use ability tests like the WISC-V or the DOS or the WJ or whatever. You can use it as part of your analysis, but it's not sufficient. So it is part of you can use others as well. You can use pieces of the NEPSI. You can use pieces of other tests, other reading tests like the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test or the CTOP probably can help you out with that. But you need to be able to make that link theoretically, hypothetically, between achievement and ability. So no, it's not always necessary to just pick out an IQ test like the WISC, but I think that you can make it a very effective part of your evaluation. All right, let me go through some more of these. See here. How do I define weaknesses in the processing areas? I find that some schools and districts are requiring a standard deviation difference to indicate a weakness, and I find that frustrating. Absolutely. Well, I agree with you. So when you think about what is a weakness, I would only use the analyses that come through with that were provided with an assessment. So doing the pairwise difference comparisons is so important. And I know that's not always done because of time, but if you're doing a computer printout, it's easy to select, at least with the Pearson, the Q Global Pearson product. You can just select the box to do the pairwise comparisons. And what that does is it allows you to look at the statistical significance and the clinical significance, and that's what I use to determine whether or not something was weak. All right, let me go down a little bit. Does the overall IQ need to be within the average range before considering the student having a learning disability? No, it does not. And the reason why it's so effective to do a PSW analysis is because it does not require that. It does not assume that a child has to be average to have a learning disability. Now, there are some things that make it complicated. So if you have a child who is considered, quote unquote, slow learner or in the at-risk category, between 70 and 85 or something, somewhere around there, you have to rule out is the child just, are they going to have a difficult time learning overall, or do they have a learning disability? So that does make it a little bit more difficult, but no, it doesn't require average IQ. Does the cognitive weakness have to be a significant weakness? Could it be a personal weakness? So I guess I'm trying to figure out how to answer that question. In that it can be a relative weakness. So if you're finding something that is not necessarily a significant weakness when compared to the other processing measures that you're giving, it has to be related to the weakness that you are observing, right? So if you find a weakness, it has to be an overall weakness, I would say, but if it's weak compared to your other cognitive skill, but not significantly, but then you find an academic task that is also significantly low or low, then you can make that comparison. So it doesn't have to be a statistical significant difference, although I think that it makes your argument much stronger. Again, my real caution here is just make sure that you know that this is a piece of data. It's not all of your data, right? This is a piece of the pie when you're answering those questions. All right, looks like we're at 2 o'clock, folks. I have a ton of questions. It's impossible for me to go through and answer all of them right now, so I really appreciate your questions. I do have a question that just came up that I could probably answer very quickly, which is, which approach is most legally accepted? Concordance, discordance, discrepancy, consistency, or cross battery? I don't think that I don't have any experience with any one of those being considered more appropriate than others. Okay, I don't think that there's anything there I don't think there's anything in the law that actually makes that distinction, and I'm glad. I would hope that the law would never make that the case, because when they put in research-based, that allows us as practitioners and as researchers and in academia to really help guide the profession. And I think we should guide ourselves in that. So I have not seen any of that. Anyway, we've gone over by a minute. I appreciate you all staying a little bit to listen to some of my answers. I will try my best to get these out. I'll look at all the questions and try to send them out. If I have emails to respond to, or if I have, send them out as a document or so. But hopefully everybody enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. It's a nice sunny day here in Pittsburgh. And have a great one. I'll talk to you all later.